You ever wake up one morning and just know something's wrong? Not because you heard anything, not because you saw anything, but because the air feels different. That's how it was that morning, cold, still, like the world was holding its breath. I just poured my first cup of coffee when I saw it, a white rectangle pinned to my front gate, catching the dawn light like it wanted to be seen. A letter, official looking. My gut tightened before I even stepped outside. The floorboards creaked under my boots, the smell of wet earth still clinging to the air. I didn't bother tying my laces, just walked across the grass, dew soaking through my socks. The gate groaned the same way it always did, but today, even that sound felt different. A brass tack held the paper tight to the wood. It was from the Sterling Meadows Homeowners Association. $100 fine. Unkempt agricultural boundary, adjacent to residential viewshed. That was their fancy way of saying they didn't like how my fence looked. I just stared at it for a second, feeling that quiet anger rise. The ink was still damp, which meant someone had walked up here in the dark just to stick it to my gate. That wasn't a fine, that was a message. Across the road sat Sterling Meadows, all those beige mansions lined up like they'd been cloned. Perfect lawns, perfect smiles. And right behind those smiles were the kind of people who thought the world should bend around them. I tore the paper off the gate, crumpled it in my hand, and looked out at my land, 500 acres of old Virginia soil. My wife's family had owned this place for generations. After she passed, this was all that was left of her and of us. Me and our daughter, June. I wasn't going anywhere. But the HOA didn't see it that way. They saw land, opportunity, a view worth millions, and the man who led them, Hal Barlow, he saw me as an obstacle. Hal was the kind of man who smiled with all his teeth and none of his eyes. Real estate developer, HOA president. He had that polished charm that fools most people, but not me. 20 years as a Navy SEAL, you learn to recognize masks, and Hal wore his better than most. The fines kept coming, 10 of them in 6 months. But that wasn't what bothered me most. It was the little things, the spray paint on my daughter's locker, a slashed tire, a rumor at school, a shove at the bus stop. They called it kids being kids. I called it what it was, pressure. June was 16, tougher than she looked, but she shouldn't have had to be. I taught her to stay aware, to trust her gut, the same way I learned to trust mine. And mine was telling me this was more than petty HOA nonsense. This was a setup. Later that morning, I heard the sound of tires on gravel. A car stopped at my gate, sleek, black, expensive. Hal Barlow. He stepped out in his pastel polo and golf shoes, pretending he was just passing by. His son, Sterling, sat in the passenger seat, same smirk, same arrogance. "Morning, Dawn," Hal said. "Got my notice, I see." "I got it," I said, not moving from the porch. "Just a formality," he continued, smiling that fake smile. "We've got rules, you understand. We like to keep a certain standard for the community." "This isn't your community," I said. "Your community ends at the asphalt." That wiped the grin right off his face just for a second. Then it came back tighter this time. "Look, Don, I've made you a generous offer. Sell the farm. Get yourself something easier to manage." "I'm not selling." He sighed, hands on his hips, pretending to be disappointed. "It's a tough place to raise a teenage girl, isn't it? All alone out here, things can happen." I didn't answer, didn't need to. I just looked him dead in the eye until he blinked first. He laughed, forced, lifted his hands like I was overreacting, and walked back to his car. But before they drove off, his son lowered his phone, looked straight at me, and dragged his finger slowly across his throat. That's when I knew. This wasn't about fences or fines anymore. This was about intimidation. Hal thought he was dealing with some stubborn farmer who didn't understand how the world worked. But he had no idea what kind of man I used to be, or what kind of father I still was. Because when you threaten a man who's lost everything except his child, you don't know it yet, but you've already lost. The wind had that sharp Virginia bite to it that afternoon, the kind that rattles the barn roof and makes the animals restless. I was in the west pasture fixing a stretch of fence a black bear had torn through the night before. It was quiet work steady, the kind that keeps your hands busy and your mind wandering. I remember thinking about dinner, about whether June would beat me home from school, about nothing that mattered, until the silence started to feel wrong. She should have been home by 4. Music on, fridge open, a teenage tornado of noise and life. But it was 4:30 now, and all I heard was the creak of the fence wire and the far-off hum of the highway. I checked my watch, told myself not to worry. Kids run late, phones die. Maybe she stopped at a friend. But that old cold feeling started crawling up my spine again. I packed up my tools and headed for the house. The sky had turned that deep copper color it gets before dusk. I called her name once, half joking, expecting to hear her yell back. Nothing. The kitchen door was ajar. Her backpack sat by the entryway where she always dropped it, but the house was too still. I called her phone, straight to voicemail. No signal bars. My stomach dropped. I stepped out onto the porch and scanned the tree line. The trail she used from the bus stop cut right through the woods and came out near the old oak. That oak had been ours since before she was born. My wife's initials and mine carved in its bark. June's tire swing used to hang from its lowest branch. Now I couldn't take my eyes off it. Something inside me knew. I grabbed the binoculars from the kitchen drawer and raised them. I could just make out movement up there near the ridge, figures. 5, maybe 6, jackets with bright school colors. My pulse spiked. I didn't think, I just moved. By the time I hit the yard, my hands were shaking. The air felt electric thick. My phone was useless in the dead zone. It might as well have been a rock. But there was something else, an old failsafe, a whistle, 2 tones, high then low, our code. I wore it around my neck. I blew it once hard, the sound slicing through the hills. Waited. Nothing. Then faint, far off, I heard it, high then low, echoing back from the ridge. Not June's tone, someone else repeating it. Finley, my neighbor to the north. A man who saw everything that happened on these hills. That signal meant one thing, danger, and not the small kind. The phone on the kitchen wall rang, shrill and old-fashioned. I sprinted back inside. "Marov," I barked. "Don," came Finley's gravel voice, short of breath. "You need to get to the oak, now." "What's happening?" "Your girl, she's up there, strung up. That Barlow kid and his pack just ran off. I tried to cut through the ravine, can't make it. Sheriff's on the way, but they're 20 minutes out. You don't have 20. For a second, the world stopped moving. Then everything went cold, clear, mechanical. My training clicked in, the part of me that used to plan rescues under fire. I hung up, grabbed my fixed-blade knife from the kitchen drawer, and ran. The helicopter was my fastest option, an old Bell 206 I used for charter flights over the Blue Ridge. I'd serviced it just last week. I hit the hangar, fueled, pre-checked, spun it up in less than 2 minutes. The turbine's roar drowned everything. I lifted off hard, banking toward the ridge, eyes scanning the patchwork fields below. The land looked so peaceful it was almost obscene. But then I saw it, the oak, standing alone on the crest like a black cross. And beneath it, a small figure hanging from a rope. "June." I pushed the cyclic forward, the rotor screaming. I wanted to drop straight down, but the slope was too uneven, rocks, brush, bad math, no safe landing zone. I circled once, heart hammering, taking it all in. The rope was looped high under her jaw, tight enough to cut off air, not life, yet. Her body jerked faintly, still fighting. I made my choice. I swung the helicopter low over the tree, close enough to rattle branches, the noise thundering like war. If those boys were still nearby, that sound would send them running and give me cover to move. I banked away, found a flat clearing 300 yards down, dropped fast, skids barely touching. Engine idling, blades still spinning. Then I ran. Every breath burned. Every heartbeat was a drum in my ears. The closer I got, the louder the sound of the rotor became, echoing against the ridge. 50 yards out, I slowed, moving silent through the trees. And there she was, my daughter, hanging limp but alive, eyes open, locked on me. I didn't speak, didn't waste a second. The rope was cheap nylon knotted by amateurs, one slice of the knife and it gave way. She fell into my arms, dead weight, light as air. Her wrists were zip-tied, swollen, her neck raw. I cut her free and laid her down gently in the leaves. 47 seconds. That's what my watch read between the moment I cut the throttle and the moment she breathed again. Her chest heaved once, then again, then she coughed, deep, ragged, alive. "Hey, kiddo," I whispered, voice shaking. She managed a rasp of a laugh. Took you long enough. Even then, humor, strength, my wife's fire in her eyes. I pulled her close, feeling the thump of her heartbeat against my chest, the smell of dust, rope, and autumn leaves filling the air. The rage inside me hardened into something cold and precise. They thought this was over, that hanging my daughter from that tree would break me. They had no idea what they'd just done. We didn't wait for the sheriff, not up there. That ridge didn't belong to them anymore. It was ours. It had always been ours. I carried June back to the helicopter, her arms draped around my neck, her breath shallow but steady. The storm clouds were rolling in from the west, dark and low, grumbling like the earth itself was angry. Fitting. She didn't say much on the way down, just held on tight. When we reached the house, I helped her inside, wrapped her in a blanket, and got her some water. Her voice was rough, her neck bruised, wrists cut where the zip ties had dug in. The rope had left a raw red line that would fade to a scar. I took one look at it and knew I'd never forget that mark for as long as I lived. She sat at the kitchen table, silent, staring at the wood grain. I didn't push her to talk. I just started working. Years of operations had drilled it into me. Feelings come later, facts come now. I pulled out my camera. Every picture had to count, the bruises, the rope burns, the swelling. Close shots, wide shots, timestamps visible. I bagged the cut zip ties, the piece of rope I'd sliced through, even the dirt from under the oak. Then I went to my office, slid the SD card from the hidden trail cam into the computer and hit play. The footage loaded, clean, crisp, and horrifying. The moment June stepped from the woods, the moment those boys appeared from the other side of the fence, their laughter caught in the still air. Sterling Barlow in front, leading like a commander of cowards. I watched every second, jaw locked tight, every muscle in my body trembling with the effort not to punch through the desk. Then came the worst part, the rope. The zip ties, the smirk. His words, silent on the video, but later confirmed by witness statement. Superman gonna fly in and save you. He had no idea how close he was to being right. The camera caught every detail, the brand of the rope, the make of their jackets, the stupid little gold watch on Sterling's wrist. Evidence, unshakable. I copied the footage twice, then twice more, on 2 drives and a cloud backup. Then I went back outside. The world looked different now, colder, quieter. I climbed that hill again, methodical, focused. The ground around the tree was torn up, footprints, scuffed dirt, drag marks. I photographed everything, bagged the rope ends, fiber samples from the bark where it had rubbed. My mind wasn't on revenge, not yet. It was on building a record they couldn't erase. When I got back, June was watching the pictures on my camera screen. Her eyes weren't crying, they were burning. They filmed it, she said softly. Sterling had his phone out the whole time. I know, I said. He was going to post it, she whispered, voice trembling with rage. He wanted everyone at school to see it. I nodded. That phone's the key, I told her. It's the one thing they can't spin, can't fake, can't hide forever, and we're going to find it. She looked up at me then, and I saw it. Not fear. Resolve. The same steel I'd seen in her mother when we first built this house. I told her to rest. She didn't argue. When she finally fell asleep on the couch, I sat in the dark, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. It hit me then this wasn't some teenage prank. It was precision, planned. The oak tree was a blind spot from their own security cameras. No cell signal, no neighbors nearby, and a perfect escape route back into Sterling Meadows. They picked that spot for a reason. And there was only one person smart enough and ruthless enough to plan it. Hal Barlow. I'd seen men like him before, boardroom generals. They let others do their fighting, but they pulled every string. Sterling was just the weapon. Hal was the hand holding it. And he'd made a mistake. He'd left fingerprints on his plan. When the deputy finally arrived, I was ready. Miller, young guy, honest eyes, local. He knew the Barlows, he knew me. I showed him everything. The trail cam footage, the photographs, the rope, the zip ties, every piece logged and bagged. He watched the video twice. When it ended, he didn't say a word, just rubbed a hand over his face and let out a long breath. This isn't hazing, he said quietly. This is attempted murder. He was right. But he also warned me the Barlows had money, lawyers, influence. They'd twist the story, call it a prank gone wrong, maybe even paint June as unstable. They'd drag us through the mud until nobody knew what was true anymore. I didn't say it out loud, but I'd already made up my mind. They could bury us in court papers and press releases, but I'd bury them in truth. As Miller packed up the evidence, I looked out the window at that oak tree silhouetted against the darkening sky. The same branch that once held my daughter's tire swing had nearly become her grave, but it wouldn't end there. Because some people don't understand mercy until they meet justice. And justice was coming, slow, steady, undeniable. And this time I wasn't just watching, I was hunting. By morning the air had changed. That crisp after-storm smell hung over the valley, wet pine, mud, and smoke from distant chimneys. June was still asleep on the couch, her breathing steady, her hand wrapped around a mug she hadn't finished. For the first time in hours, she looked like a kid again. I wanted to let her stay that way, but the fight wasn't over. The sheriff's office had the evidence, but I knew how this would go. Men like Hal Barlow didn't get handcuffed. They got handshakes. They paid, they spun, they smiled their way out. I wasn't going to give him that chance. There was one missing link, one thread that tied the whole thing together. A boy named Caleb. I'd seen his face in the footage. He wasn't laughing like the rest. He kept glancing toward the woods, nervous like a kid who knew he'd gone too far. His father was new in town, a doctor, decent reputation. They weren't cut from the same rotten cloth as the Barlows. That meant Caleb could be cracked. I left June a note, locked the doors. Don't open for anyone but me or the deputy. Then I got in my truck and drove into Sterling Meadows. That place always looked the same, a perfect lie. Manicured lawns, white fences, every mailbox painted the same dull shade of gray. The kind of neighborhood where silence isn't peace, it's pressure. I parked down the street from Caleb's house and waited. An hour later, he stepped out the back door toward the detached garage, phone in hand, earbuds in. 17, built like a string bean, shoulders hunched like he was already carrying the weight of what he'd done. "Caleb," I said quietly. He spun so fast he nearly dropped his phone. When he saw me, the color drained from his face. "Mr. Marov, I don't." I took a slow step forward, hands at my sides. "You know why I'm here." He swallowed hard, eyes darting toward the house like he was about to yell for help. I didn't raise my voice. "I have a video," I said. "It shows you, it shows all of you, and it shows what your friend did to my daughter." He froze, the words hit him like a physical blow. For a second I saw it, the truth cracking through the fear. "It was just a prank," he whispered, voice shaking. "Sterling said we just had to scare her. I swear we didn't mean." "You put a rope around her neck," I cut in, voice low, cold. "You zip-tied her hands. That's not a prank, that's a felony." He flinched like the word itself hurt. His eyes started to glisten. "Sterling said his dad wanted to send a message. He said you were—" He stopped himself, pressing a trembling hand to his forehead. "Finish it," I said. "He said your daughter was the key, that if you thought she wasn't safe, you'd sell the farm. His dad told him to make it look like she tried to hurt herself." For a moment, all I heard was wind, the kind that roars in your ears when the blood drains from your head. They weren't just trying to scare her, they were staging something. They wanted it to look like a suicide. My voice came out steady, but inside I was shaking. "Can you prove that?" He hesitated, then pulled out his phone with shaking hands. He scrolled through a chat and turned the screen toward me. It was all there, a group text between the boys, messages from Sterling. "Dad says it's on the oak tree. Make it look convincing. Get the rope from the garage. I'll bring the ties." The timestamps matched everything. The trail cam, the attack, the rescue. I told him, forward every message to this number. I handed him a slip of paper with my cell. "Then send them to your parents, and when Deputy Miller calls, you tell him everything, exactly like you told me." Tears streaked down his cheeks as he hit forward. My phone buzzed in my pocket, the files coming through, one after another like digital confessions. He wiped his face, terrified. "What's gonna happen to me?" "That depends on whether you keep telling the truth," I said quietly. "You're a kid who made a mistake. They're men who built it." He nodded, shoulders shaking. I could see the weight lifting as he realized he wasn't just trapped, he had a way out. I turned to leave, boots crunching on the immaculate driveway. "Mr. Marov," he called out, voice breaking. "I'm sorry." I didn't look back, so am I. By the time I reached the truck, my phone was still buzzing file after file, the chain of guilt stretching from that oak tree straight to Hal Barlow's office. Back home, June was awake, standing by the window. "Did you get something?" she asked. I handed her my phone. She scrolled through the messages, her lips pressed tight. When she reached the one that said, "Dad says it's on the oak tree," she stopped. Her hands trembled. "He really said this." "He did," I said, "and now everyone's going to know." That night, Deputy Miller came back. I showed him the texts, the timestamps, everything. He read them twice, jaw tightening. "This is enough for a grand jury," he said. "Conspiracy, attempted murder, kidnapping, we can go for all of it." But I was already thinking bigger. Hal Barlow had built his world on lies, perfect lawns, polite smiles, and quiet power. I was going to burn it down the same way he'd built it, in public. Not with fists, not with bullets. With the truth under bright lights, where everyone could see him fall. And when the time came, I was going to make sure he heard that same question his son had asked my daughter. "Superman gonna fly in and save you?" Because this time I would. The house felt smaller after everything went public, like the walls had shrunk around the truth. The TV in the living room droned with local news, the anchor's voice flat and careful, saying allegations and investigation. But inside, at the kitchen table, the words on my screen were sharper than any headline. Timestamps, texts, photos. They didn't equivocate. They didn't hedge. They were the kind of proof that makes a lie impossible to wear like a suit. When you live by facts, you learn to let them do the heavy lifting, so we let them. I slept in short bursts that week, the kind of sleep where you wake up with the taste of adrenaline and the shape of plans already forming in your head. June healed slowly, the purple on her wrists yellowing, the red line at her throat paling each day. She moved around like a soldier recovering from a scrape, careful, focused, distant in the way bravery sometimes is. We both needed that distance. We both needed purpose. Deputy Miller did his job the way a man with a conscience does, quietly and thoroughly. He brought warrants, he made calls, he threaded the evidence through the system like a needle. The sheriff's office recovered other videos, phones, messages. Some assets vanished. Others turned up in parents' garages, in Dropbox folders, in the cloud backups kids never thought to scrub. One after another, the physical threads of Hal Barlow's plan unraveled and landed, ugly and obvious, on investigators' desks. But money buys noise. Hal's camp hired lawyers who wrote press releases with the practiced tone of people who sleep on leather couches and eat dinners with city councilmen. Regrettable incident, they called it. High school hazing. They sent out glossy statements, arranged interviews with sympathetic columnists, and tried to craft an alternative truth that smelled faintly of desperation and disinfectant. It was predictable and poisonous. They wanted to drown us in doubt. That's when the real neighbors showed up. Not the ones with manicured hedges and HOA loyalty, but the ones who'd been on these hills for longer than the clubhouses and the construction loans. Finley stopped by the house one morning with a thermos and a scowl. The old rancher had a way of walking like the land owned him back. He planted his boots by the counter and said, "You did the right thing, son." Simple, bone deep. In 2 days, a stack of neighbors' testimonies appeared in Deputy Miller's inbox. Farmers, a retired judge, a schoolteacher, Dr. Evans. They hadn't rushed in because they liked drama. They rushed in because their moral compasses had started ticking the second they saw the facts. Dr. Evans, sharp, no-nonsense, the kind of ER doctor who sees life and death on a Tuesday afternoon and refuses to be impressed, wrote a formal medical opinion that called what happened to June attempted strangulation. That sentence sat in the center of the case like a rock in a river, splitting the current. It was clinical, immovable, and it made lawyers on both sides take a long, slow breath. When a retired judge called the sheriff and promised to pull in state resources if the local office didn't, the scale tipped another degree. People with names and reputations started doing the thing that rumor and money had hoped to prevent. They used their credibility to amplify the truth. At the HOA meetings, the tension was a living thing. Board members who had once smiled with Hal's polished grin began to cough on their words. A few resigned, some sent terse letters about family obligations and workload. The clubhouse that used to ring with polite applause started to hum with anxious questions. Money can't always paper over guilt when enough light gets in. The developer's carefully maintained image began to show hairline cracks. People started whispering. People who'd sat in Hal's shadow for years began to remember what it felt like to stand in the sun. It wasn't all victory speeches and vindication. The Barlow machine pushed back hard. They filed motions, they subpoenaed, they threatened countersuits meant to exhaust and intimidate. For a moment, there was a dizzying, ugly fear that the system's slowness would outlast our stamina, that the legal grind would bleed us dry. I thought of my wife's quiet way of keeping faith in small things, and I fought the urge to fold. June needed me steady, not spectacular. So we did the small, stubborn things that win in the long run. We kept meticulous logs. We duplicated evidence to drives and cloud accounts. We met with Miller and with the DA, who finally said the words you want to hear. We have probable cause. It was a legal hinge, dry and consequential. The county prosecutor started arranging grand jury schedules and witness subpoenas. The machinery of justice, slow as it is, was finally moving in our direction. Outside the legal storm, life found a way to be ordinary. June went back to school in fits and starts. She carried her backpack a little differently, like armor you don't show off. We put up an extra camera on the oak, obvious, unhidden, a bright lens that blinked like a promise. I bought a bell and hung it on the branch where the rope had been, a clear tone to ring whenever the valley needed to remember who we were. We took small walks down by the fence, boots crunching in sync, letting the world know we weren't fragile things to be moved. Every night I checked the files and felt the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd set a trap for a bully and watched it close. But I also felt the weight of what came next at courtrooms, testimony, the inevitable attempts to humiliate June into silence. Money tries to buy time and endurance, but truth buys allies, and allies showed up. The storm had begun, and it was no longer just over our farm. It was moving across the valley, and Hal Barlow was already starting to feel the wind. I knew there would be confrontations ahead, lawyers with shiny shoes, press with hungry cameras, men who thought public spectacle could save them. But I also knew something else, quieter and more absolute. When the people who live in a place decide that something's wrong, it becomes very hard to pretend it is. We were ready, the evidence was stacked, the neighbors were gathering, the county was awake. And somewhere under all the legalese and schedules and threats, I was planning one public moment where the truth would be impossible to ignore. The night of the fundraiser smelled like perfume and cheap cologne, and the kind of nervous pride only rich people can afford. Glass chandeliers glinted like teeth over the ballroom, and the Sterling Meadows logo projected big and white above the stage. Men in tuxedos laughed too loudly, women in silk clutched their phones and posed like props. Hal Barlow floated through it all, practiced and polished, an island of confidence built from contracts and campaign donations. He looked untouchable. He was exactly where he wanted to be. I wasn't supposed to be there. I wore jeans and a scuffed jacket and boots that still had mud on them. I didn't come through the front doors. I came through a small door at the back with an IT kid who owed June a favor and a password on a sticky note. He pointed me to a cramped control booth where the soundboard smelled like old electricity and spilled beer. Down below, people were applauding a check presentation. Hal stood at the lectern, thanking everyone for their generosity. I counted my breaths and told myself to move slow. Patience was a weapon as sharp as any knife. On my laptop, I had everything queued up, the trail cam footage, the close-ups of June's injuries, the text that said, plain as a contract, "Dad says it's on the oak tree, make it look convincing." I didn't want noise. I wanted proof to speak loud enough that lies couldn't drown it out. I hit play. The Sterling Meadows logo disappeared. Grainy, time-stamped footage filled the screen. A room full of people who'd never seen real fear watched as a girl walked out of the trees and was surrounded by boys in jackets. The camera held every humiliating detail: the rope, the zip ties, the smirk on Sterling's face. The sound from my cockpit cam came in, the whine of the helicopter, Finley's voice hollering a warning, my own ragged breathing. The volume cut through the polite chatter like a bell. You could have heard a pin drop. Glass paused in mid-raise, eyes narrowed. Hal's smile peeled off his face like cheap paint. He took a step back from the podium as the video cut to photos of June's bruised throat and wrists. The words from those texts marched across the screen in letters big enough to be seen from the parking lot. People read them out loud like they were taking inventory of a sin. Faces around the ballroom went from curiosity to horror to disgust. I watched Hal's shoulders shrink under the weight of 1,000 private conversations, finally made public. Sterling went pale. He lunged. I expected movement. I'd planned for it. He was a boy with a chip on his shoulder and no plan beyond acting out. I met him at the edge of the stage. He threw a wild punch because that's what bullies do when the world stops believing them. It was over in a breath. One clean takedown. No theater, no showmanship, just a man protecting his kid. Then the doors opened wide and men in uniform walked through, steady and real. Deputy Miller moved like he'd been waiting for this day. He read rights. He cuffed wrists. Hal's lawyers tried to shout into the maelstrom, but the room had already decided. The sheen of Hal's life, his donations, his trophies, his carefully curated neighborhood began to peel away in front of his peers. For all his money, there was nowhere for him to hide under those lights. I didn't stay for the aftermath. I stepped out into the rain and let it soak me. It tasted like clean things, fresh dirt, cold metal, the honest wet of a storm. I thought of the kids who'd laughed and filmed and walked away. I thought of the men who stood behind them in suits and said, "It's just hazing." Watching them taken from the room was not a joy so much as a relief, a release of pressure that had built up in my chest for weeks. The next days were loud in a different way: court dates, press calls, lawyers with clipped vowels and leather briefcases. Hal's world didn't collapse all at once. It cratered slowly as evidence mounted and witnesses told what they saw. The board splintered. People who once orbited Hal's approval drifted away. Sterling and the other boys faced charges. Their parents faced the kind of questions money can't answer in public. The developers' plans for Phase 2 of Sterling Meadows stalled, and then died under the weight of subpoenas and bad press. But legal victories aren't the heart of what changed. The valley changed. People who'd lived here for years came forward. Neighbors who had kept their heads down now spoke up. The courthouse filled with people who remembered what it meant to own land and keep faith with one another. In quiet rooms, speeches were made not for cameras, but to reknit something that had frayed: trust. At home, June washed out her hair and watched the news like someone replaying a bad dream until she understood where it had ended. She took slow steps toward normal, school, friends, a laugh that didn't sound brittle. We hung a camera on the oak, bright and obvious, like a sign that we'd learned from what happened. I hung the bell where the rope had been. We rang it once the day the indictments were filed, letting the sound roll across the hills like a small, public exhale. There's a funny thing about justice. It's rarely cinematic in the way people imagine. It's paperwork and patience and the steady insistence of good people doing small things well. But that night in the ballroom, when truth unspooled on a projector and the room had to choose, I felt something old and quiet come back to life. Not revenge, not triumph. A sense that right had reasserted itself, not because I made it, but because the community refused to look away. In the weeks that followed, people would ask me why I chose to expose Hal in public instead of letting the system do its work quietly. The answer is simple. Hal had tried to hide his violence behind a polished smile. He tried to turn a child's terror into a bargaining chip. He'd counted on shame and influence to make the crime small, so I didn't give him that luxury. I showed the world what he'd done, and in doing so I made sure no one could pretend they didn't see. When the rain finally stopped and the valley smelled clean again, I walked up the ridge and listened. The bell on the oak chimed once, clear and bright. It wasn't a sound of victory. It was a sound of promise, an ordinary, stubborn promise that this place belonged to the people who lived on it, not the ones who tried to buy it. The morning after the arrests, the valley was wrapped in fog. The kind that moves slow, like it's thinking about where to settle. The air smelled of damp cedar and diesel from the sheriff's cruisers that had idled along the ridge through the night. I stood on the porch with my coffee, watching the mist crawl across the pasture, listening to the silence that follows a storm. It wasn't peace yet, more like the pause between battles, but it was something. Inside, June was still asleep on the couch. The bruises on her neck had faded to pale yellow now, the swelling nearly gone. The girl who used to flinch at every sound was breathing steady. She was safe. That should have been enough. But every time I looked out toward Sterling Meadows, I felt that old knot in my chest tighten again. Justice has a way of feeling incomplete when it comes late. Deputy Miller pulled up around 9. He killed the engine, stepped out with that same quiet energy of a man who knows the worst part is over but the paperwork is. He took off his hat and nodded. "We got them arraigned," he said. "Judge denied bail for Hal, flight risk. His lawyers nearly threw a fit." I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything. "You did good, Don," he said after a pause. "Not many folks would have handled it the way you did." I smiled at that, a small one. Wasn't much choice. He looked at the oak tree in the distance. "You ever going to cut it down?" I shook my head. "No, I think it's earned the right to stand." He smiled, understanding more than he said, then drove off to face his mountain of reports. Later that day, the reporters came. They were polite at first, quiet shoes on gravel, low voices, cameras pointed at the house from the end of the drive. One of them shouted a question about closure. I didn't answer. Closure's a word for people who didn't have to live through the thing they're reporting on. For us, it wasn't closure. It was aftermath. That night, June sat beside me on the porch steps, wrapped in a blanket, the fog lifting off the valley like steam. "Dad," she said softly, "you think they'll remember." "Who?" "The people, the ones who watched it all happen." I thought for a long moment before answering. "Some will," I said. "Some will want to forget, but that's not our job. Our job is to remember enough for the ones who can't." She leaned her head against my shoulder. The crickets started up, slow and even, and for the first time in weeks, it sounded like home again. A week later, the county held a public hearing about dissolving the Sterling Meadows HOA board. The meeting hall overflowed. People who'd been too scared to speak before now lined up to tell stories, small abuses, fines that made no sense, pressure to sell, threats whispered behind policy. The room pulsed with anger and relief. It wasn't about us anymore. It was about everyone who'd been made to feel small in their own homes. When they called my name to speak, I walked to the front slowly, feeling every eye in the room. I wasn't a man who liked microphones, but I'd learned that silence protects the wrong people. "I didn't come here to gloat," I began, voice low but steady. "I came here because people need to know that this isn't about fences or property lines. It's about the kind of community we choose to be. You let fear run things long enough, and eventually it turns into cruelty. You let a man like Barlow decide what's right, and soon you forget you ever had a say." I paused, looking around at the faces, neighbors, workers, even some of Hal's former supporters, eyes downcast. "The land doesn't care about rules written on paper," I said. "It remembers footsteps, kindness, the way you treat the people who share it with you. That's the only law that lasts." When I finished, the room didn't erupt or cheer. It just stood, everyone on their feet, clapping slow, steady, like they'd remembered something important they'd lost. The board voted unanimously to dissolve. The HOA that had once ruled with polished smiles and hidden threats ceased to exist before the sun went down. Back home, June watched the live stream on her laptop. When the vote passed, she looked at me, half smiling. "Guess Superman showed up after all." I laughed quietly. Guess he did. But later that night, after she went to bed, I stood by the window watching the moon rise over the ridge and thought about what she'd said. Superman doesn't exist. No one flies in to save you. You just stand your ground until you remember you can save yourself. That's what she'd done. That's what we all had to do. I stepped outside, the night air cool against my face, and listened to the bell on the oak. It chimed once in the wind, soft, certain, final, not a victory song, a heartbeat. The kind that says, "It's over but not forgotten." And that's when I realized, sometimes, justice doesn't arrive in a courtroom. It arrives in the quiet when the world finally tells the truth out loud. The valley healed slow, the way old wounds do. Grass grew back where the sheriff's trucks had left tire marks, and the oak tree's new leaves came in bright, soft green. The rope scar was still there, a dark line wrapped around the branch like a reminder that some histories don't wash off. Every morning I walked past it with my coffee, touched the rough bark, and told myself to keep moving. June started smiling again, not the careful, "I'm okay" kind, the real kind. She went back to her music lessons, started working weekends at the feed store, learned how to drive the truck across the pasture without stalling it. Every small victory felt like a miracle measured in ordinary things. The house sounded different with her laughter in it again, lighter somehow, less haunted. The county trial took months. I sat through every hearing watching Hal Barlow shrink under the same lights he used to command. His lawyers talked about technicalities, tried to dismiss evidence, but truth has a way of echoing louder than excuses. When the jury came back, it was short and simple: guilty. Conspiracy, attempted murder, obstruction. Sterling got time too, though less. The other boys were sentenced to community service and rehabilitation programs. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited, their microphones hungry for a statement. I gave them one line: "You can't buy silence forever." Then I walked away. Life after that wasn't a movie ending. It was bills and dust and fixing fences. It was living with the knowledge that evil doesn't just come from strangers. Sometimes it grows in familiar soil, watered by greed and arrogance. But it was also about learning that decency can survive if enough people refuse to let it die. One evening, a few months after the verdict, June and I drove into town for supplies. We stopped at the diner, the one with the cracked red booths and the jukebox that still played Elvis if you kicked it right. The waitress, Maria, brought us coffee without asking and patted June's hand. Nobody stared anymore. The whispers had turned into nods, the kind you give someone who's earned respect the hard way. On the way back, the sun dipped low, painting the hills gold. The road curved along the ridge, and from there you could see the whole valley, the pastures, the barns, the distant outline of Sterling Meadows, its once perfect lawns now overgrown, the "for sale" signs leaning tired in the wind. Developers had moved on, and the place was quiet again. June rolled down the window and let the wind catch her hair. "Feels like it's ours again," she said. "It always was," I told her. When we got home, Finley was waiting by the gate. He had a box in the bed of his truck. Inside was a small bronze plaque. "Found a guy in town who does good work," he said. "Figured the oak deserved something." We walked up the hill together, the sun setting behind us. The plaque read, "For the ones who stood their ground, for the ones who refused to be silent." We fixed it into the earth beneath the tree. June brushed the dirt from her hands, looked up at the branch, and smiled. The bell-eyed hung there caught the evening breeze, its sound rolling down the valley, soft and clean. After Finley left, we sat there a while longer, watching the stars blink on. Crickets started their nightly chorus, and for the first time in a long time, the quiet didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. June broke the silence first. "You ever miss it?" "Miss what?" "The teams, the missions, the adrenaline." I thought about that for a long time. "Sometimes," I said, "but this," I gestured at the fields, the sky, the oak, "this is the only mission that ever mattered." She nodded, thoughtful. "Guess saving one person's enough." "More than enough," I said. We sat there until the sky went full dark. Somewhere far below, a coyote called, and the sound echoed off the hills. The bell chimed again, faint but clear, answering it. And for the first time since that morning months ago when I'd found the notice pinned to my gate, I felt the world settle. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but right enough. Because the thing about evil men is, they always think they're the ones writing the story. But the truth has its own way of taking the pen back. I stood up, brushed the dirt off my jeans, and looked out over the land. The same stretch of soil my wife had loved. The same ridge where my daughter had almost died, now bathed in the silver light of a calm night. Some stories don't end with fire or fury. They end quietly, with peace hard-earned and pain remembered. With a father who kept his promise, and a girl who learned that even when monsters wear smiles, they still fall. The wind picked up once more, carrying the smell of rain and pine. I put my arm around June's shoulders, and we started the slow walk back down the hill. Behind us, the bell rang again, one last time. And its sound rolled through the valley like a prayer, steady, honest, unbroken. "You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew."